Well, if anybody's ever seen like one of those tennis ball machines that just fires them out to that the tennis person can practice their backhand.
I think there's a basketball thing that does that too.
Oh yeah, they've got one of those. I'm just going to be that machine today. Contradiction. Just throw them out, and we're going to see if the salty pastor can, has a nice backhand or not. I guess.
I'm excited. Everyone, strap in.
Let's see what we can do.
It's going to get wild. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Salty Pastor Podcast, a podcast dedicated to helping you learn and grow in your faith. It is a journey that you must take. It is something that you have to do yourself. It is not something you can order out for. It's not something you can have delivered. It's not something you can stream to your mobile device or your brain yet. Just kidding.
Not yet.
Not yet, but someone will probably tell you someday
Amazon's
that you
working on
can.
it.
Yeah, they're working on it.
Yep.
But instead, it is something that you have to do, and we will come alongside you to encourage you, to challenge you, to teach you to critically think for yourself. But it is work that you have to do. My name is Jesse Maher. I will be your host. And on this wonderful day, I have both the original Salty Pastor and the Diet Salty Pastor.
Diet salt.
Diet
He's thinner.
Salt. I don't know. Yes. Do they not have artificial salt these days? We have artificial sugar. That's not a thing. Okay.
I felt like there were so many words I was ready for, and then you said
And
diet,
I did
and I
none
was
of
like,
them.
what?
What? How does that fit in there?
So we have Dr. Douglas Peake and his son, Zac Peake, both who have spent, obviously, a lot of time here on the podcast. But we are blessed to have all three of us on one desk in one day to hash out some very exciting things today.
Sweet.
We are in our series titled The Bible. Last week we kicked it off, and this week we've been talking about all kinds of things as far as why it's controversial, and why what it claims as far as the words and the revelation of God, and it tells us that God is there and that He wants to be part of our lives, and that there's a whole history of what He's done in the world since its creation. And ultimately, the bridge is one of the ways we can communicate with Him, right? But there's a lot of people out there who don't believe that this is true, that they assert that there are contradictions in the Bible. And I think today we are going to be talking through some of those contradictions. And then obviously Sunday, Zach's going to be preaching, and he's going to talk about those more. But I want to get us kicked off with Zach. What did you bring to the table today for us to either revel at or argue with?
Well, if anybody's ever seen like one of those tennis ball machines that just fires them out to that the tennis person can practice their backhand.
I think there's a basketball thing that does that too.
Oh yeah, they've got one of those. I'm just going to be that machine today. Contradiction. Just throw them out, and we're going to see if the salty pastor can, has a nice backhand or not. I guess.
I'm excited. Everyone, strap in.
Let's
today
see what we can
is
do.
going to get wild.
Yeah.
All right, so let's just talk about a bunch of them. We're going to start with some softballs to you because I read these and instantly I was like, oh boy, oh wow. So we'll see what you think. First off, this is from the American Atheists. If you just Google Bible contradictions, then the first result is a page by the American Atheists titled Bible Contradictions.
Man, they're just feeding us content.
Yeah, they're a big help. So shout out to them today. Their first contradiction, the Sabbath day. In Exodus, it says, remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. This is a law given to the Israelites. And then in Romans 14:5, it says, one man esteemeth one day above another, another esteemeth every day alike. Let every man be fully persuaded by his own mind. But God just said to keep the Sabbath day holy, and now Paul's like, oh, you can treat all days equal, and that's okay. That's a huge contradiction, Pastor.
Well, not really, because that basically has three fallacies. The first fallacy is, there's three. The first fallacy is the fallacy of presupposition, and that is that they're assuming, all things considered, that that's it. That's you reduce it. It's a reductionist argument. And so that fallacy basically doesn't take into account that this is a revelation that plays out over a period of time, and that like any story, there are changes in it, right? So
Changes are not necessarily contradictions.
Changes are not contradictions. And, in Mark chapter 2, verse 28, it says that Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath. And the whole point is that if you want to find a contradiction in something, thing, then you need to have intellectual honesty, in my opinion. And that is, you need to at least say, well, what is a story? And I have sat down because I have quoted the Quran before, right? And so I sat down and I read the Quran and I went through it. And I read a translation from the 14th century that is considered the most accurate English translation of the Quran. There's not a lot of translations of the Quran because you're supposed to read it in Arabic, right? You're not technically allowed to read it in any other language.
Okay.
But this one does exist. And so I have that Quran, I read it, and because I'm like, well, I need to read it in context, and I need to go, there's 150 surahs, and I need to read them, and what is it? And I have to understand it first, because before you criticize something, you should say, I need to give it a fair hearing and understand what it's trying to say, and once I understand, then I need to decide whether I agree with it. So that's the first fallacy, is there's no attempt to even understand that this is a story being played out. The second thing is that it is a fallacy of definition, and that is, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, and then one man esteemeth one day above another esteemeth every day alike. And why are they quoting out of the King James Bible?
I was going to ask that. I was like, why did they give us the NIV version for Exodus, and then they went full King James in the New
I know, isn't that kind of crazy? So, and so he says, let every man be fully persuaded. Okay, so what we have here is a fallacy of definition, and that is that, okay, he's saying, remember the Sabbath, and then he's saying here, one man esteemeth a day above another day. Okay, you haven't defined what days he's talking about.
Because they pulled it out of context. They just ripped a verse out of the Bible.
What days is he talking about? And is it technically a Sabbath day or not a Sabbath day? And so you would need to define the terms. And then the second of all, you have to bring into the first fallacy in that, well, what's changed from when this was written to when that one was written? So you have a story about a guy, he grows up and he has heart trouble and then he becomes a vegan, right? Well, you can read when he was a teenager eating meat, right? Oh, I love a good steak. And then later on, after his heart trouble, he becomes a vegan and he says, vegan's the only way to go. Oh, those are contradictions. Well, actually, no, they're not.
There's a through line. You're just not looking at it.
Yeah. And so, that points also to the third fallacy, which is a logical, the logical syllogism is false. In other words, if you have a false definitions, a lack of clarity of definitions, and you have a lack of understanding about the presupposition on which your argument is built, then your logic is faulty as well. So that would be my initial thing, and that is that the entire Bible isn't about the Sabbath, it's about Jesus. And the whole point about Jesus is that he's the Lord of the Sabbath, and we find our rest in him.
There you go.
What do you think? Is that a good synopsis?
I was going to add thoughts, but we spent 5 minutes on one.
So I was going to say, that's the softball, and Pastor Doug just tore it up. I think the only thing I would add in is, ultimately, I think you've talked about this before, it's not necessarily the day that is important, it's the fact that we're taking rest and where we're finding the rest, right? And so it's like, there's people that celebrate the Sabbath on Saturday, there's people that celebrate the Sabbath on Sunday, there's some people that work at church, there's a lot of people in ministry that their official Sabbath, quote unquote, is like a Monday, because that's their day that they're actually taking to focus on God and rest, right? And so it is not about anymore, since the New Testament was written, the fact that it's a specific day anymore, but in fact that you are taking time to rest and refocus on God, right?
Yeah, because the Sabbath in the Old Testament was a criteria of the law for the Jewish people. It was a covenant. Okay. Then in the New Testament, the covenant is Jesus. So he's the Lord of the Sabbath.
There's new rules, new game. No longer applies.
Yeah. That's why Judaism and Christianity are different religions.
What?
Oh, are they?
Did you not know that? Yeah, so that one's fun. I'm going to skip. There's a lot of ones on this page. If anyone goes to the American Atheist Bible Contradiction page, there are quite a few that say the first verse is from the Old Testament and the second verse is from the New Testament.
Yes.
And all of those fallacies would apply.
I mean, maybe not every single one, but
pretty close.
Much. Yeah, pretty close to every single one. So I feel like we should not. That's kind of a category. And so we're going to move on to some other categories. For instance, one thing they do have here is they have contradictions that are only in like the Old Testament. It's like, okay, because we just said that Jesus changed everything, which, he kind of did. That's kind of the point of our faith.
Right.
But what about in the Old Testament contradictions that exist there? One example they have here is in trusting God. They have a part of a verse in Proverbs, not the whole thing, but a part that says, a good man obtaineth favor of the Lord. That King James version again, we obtaineth. And then there's a verse from Job, and basically, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the story of Job is that Job is considered a righteous man by God, and then the devil comes and says, well, Job's only righteous because you've given him things. If you take them away, then he won't be righteous anymore. And so God says, okay, you are allowed to take these things away. And so it's like, is that not a contradiction that Proverbs says that if you trust in God, you'll obtain his favor? But Job trusted in God, and Job had a pretty rough time.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the problem with this, man, they're going to really great lengths to try to come up with.
These are stretches.
Yeah,
They
these
are
are really,
stretches.
really stretches. You know, it's like saying that Romeo and Juliet is a story about euthanasia. You know, I'm like, what are you talking about? You're just like. It's hard to argue with people who are just so idiotic.
Yeah.
You know, I'm like, throw something out there that
Well,
is.
on this one, we talk about the favor of the Lord, and we talk about the blessings of God.
Yeah.
Are the blessings of God lots of money? Are the blessings of God
Yeah.
driving a nice car? I mean, are these the things that if you trust in God, he's just going to give them to you?
Right.
Yeah.
Like,
No. Like, you know what was a blessing in the early church? To be martyred.
Yeah.
They literally considered it. Early Christians for the first, 200 years
Yeah.
of the faith after Jesus ascended, they literally saw it as a blessing and an
Yeah.
honor to be martyred for their faith.
Like in Acts 3 and 4, it's like they were, Peter and the apostles were
Yeah.
beaten.
Whipped,
Right?
I think.
They were
weren't
whipped
Yeah.
and beaten by the Sanhedrin, and it says they praised God that they could suffer like Jesus.
Yeah. And
So-
so it's that favor of the Lord.
Yeah.
It's
It's
one of
again,
those
it's a
definitional
definition.
things,
Yeah,
right?
it's a fallacy of you don't clearly make any. You don't define the terms, and then
Yeah.
you're trying to say, you're conflating. That's what,
Yeah.
and that's what people who do have no intellectual honesty do is they conflate.
Well, and you know what the best part about this is? Job trusted God, and he had a pretty rough time. Have you read the end of Job?
have you read
sir?
the end of Job?
Because
Obviously
keep
not.
because at the end it says he was given double of everything he had before. So
Yeah.
I feel like that's a little bit, he did trust in God, and then he did obtain God's favor. So your own story disproves your argument.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can find some better ones. There's a lot of, there's a lot of silliness in here because a lot of these take just a basic understanding of Christianity. There was a good one that contrasted Ezekiel with Exodus, and I don't have the verse right in front of me right now, but here it is. In Ezekiel 18:20, it says, "The son shall bear the iniquity of the father." And there are, I don't remember if it's in Exodus or a different book in the Pentateuch that has God. He says, if there is an evil man or an evil parents or whatever, the curse of them will be on them for 3 or 4 generations. But if someone is good, they will be blessed for thousands of generations.
yes.
Do you recall which verse that is, Salty Pastor?
Well, in Ezekiel 18:20, it specifically says this. It says, this is another problem. They say, this is a contradiction, but you don't even quote the whole verse, or the whole sentence. Usually have to say, because what if it says,
you can just take and splice?
yeah,
can't you?
take
You
a
get to do whatever
slice,
you
the person who sins will die. A son will not suffer the punishment for the father's guilt, nor will a father suffer the punishment for the son's guilt. The righteousness of the righteous will be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked will be upon himself. And so what they did is just a basic a misrepresentation, because what he's saying is that here the son shall not bear the iniquity of the father. He's saying, what he's talking about is the judgment of righteousness falls upon the person who committed the sin.
Okay, but
So
if
he's
that's the
clarifying
case,
that.
Then what does it mean in Exodus 20 verse 5 when it says, "I am the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children into the 3rd and 4th generation"?
Well, I think it's very specific in its understanding. I mean, most scholars have looked at this over and over and come to the same point, is that it's another frame of reference fallacy, and that is, well, if your frame of reference is that God treats every human being like a pawn and you have no free will, isn't that the atheist position, by the way? That you have no choice in the matter, right? And that you're not responsible for your sins, then you look at it from the standpoint, what God's saying is that he's going to punish you, and then he's going to punish your kids and your kids and your kids and your kids and your kids, right? Because that's your frame of reference, because that's what God does.
If you read that at a glance, that's what it seems to say.
But if you read in the entire book of Exodus and you look at what God is doing, what is the entire book of Exodus about?
saving
law.
people from
The Exodus. Them leaving,
Exodus.
Them leaving Egypt.
It's
yeah.
in the name.
And I-
In the
that was a
name.
softball.
Man,
that
I
was
stumped the
whiffed on.
guys. Wow. Okay, and what was the Exodus all about? What was God doing for the Israelite people?
Freeing them from Egypt.
He was saving them.
Mm-hmm.
He was freeing them, right? But he said in order to be saved, you have to choose to do what? Follow me. You're going to have to choose to follow Moses. And where did Moses lead them? Out into the desert, right? And what did they complain about when they got out there?
Food,
Yeah,
heat,
you let us out
everything.
here to
Basically
die.
everything.
We want to go back to Egypt. So the whole book, you have to read the whole book and say, well, what's the point of the story? What's the point of the book? And what he's talking, and what that does is that gives you the frame of reference. That God's heart is that He is not a person that is using them as pawn. He doesn't take away their free will. So with that in mind, right? If you are a person who chooses to reject wisdom and you do something sinful, right, and you live a sinful lifestyle, you reject wisdom, does that impact your children?
Yes.
Does it
Yes.
impact your children's children?
Probably.
Do you remember just a few weeks ago on the
was gonna
Salty
bring that up,
Pastor, I brought up the illustration of Jonathan Edwards' children and
Yes.
offspring,
Absolutely.
and then the other guy who was a criminal.
Yeah.
Right? And you look at that and you go, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. See, so what happens is the iniquity, and this is really important, is people don't understand what iniquity is. Okay? Iniquity is different than sin. Okay? And not in its content, right? Because iniquity and sin are the same thing, but in their what would you call it? Your positional judgment. So sin is something that you commit, right? And I've committed a sin. I've missed the mark. Iniquity is because of all these sins in your life, you are positionally in this place.
That's like your circumstances.
Your circumstances, yeah. So you're in iniquity. You're stuck. And so, case in point, you decide to go out and get drunk, right? And that happens. Oh, that's a sin. Okay, well, what happens the next night? You decide, I'm going to go out and get drunk. And then I'm going to do it again and again and again and again. And after about a year of getting drunk every night, what do you become? An alcoholic.
Okay. I was like,
so
are we looking for another softball here, or are we looking for something different?
you become, and so alcoholism is iniquity. You see, addictions are iniquities. Anger problems are iniquities. Unforgiveness, bitterness, malice, hatred are that's iniquity.
And that affects your kids.
And that will affect your kids, and it'll affect your kids' kids, and your kids' kids' kids, up into the 7th generation. So if a parent decides to live in iniquity, the impact of that lifestyle will it takes 7 generations before it can be completely removed from the family influence.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Well, we've kind of tackled now one that was like difference between Old and New Testament, which is just very much a lack of understanding of kind of the Christian faith in general. So that was one of the contradictions, and that a lot of the contradictions you'll see out there are really just a lack of understanding about what Jesus has done and the difference between Old and New Testament. We just did one that's a little bit about the theology in the Old Testament. I want to try to get through 2 more, one of which will be in the Gospels. About the differences in the story. And if we have time, I want to do a second one in the theology about the New Testament. So let's attack the gospel one first. Let me find the exact verses. In Matthew 28:8, it says, the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. But in Mark 16:8, it says, trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Well, that seems like those are the Gospels, which are supposed to be at least kind of historical about Jesus, and they're saying kind of opposite things about the story, aren't they?
What was the second reference again? Mark what?
Mark 16:8.
16. Okay, let me get it up here. Well, I think here is something that has gone on for quite some time, in that a lot of people have said that the whole resurrection account is suspect. Okay. And there's a lot of criticism around that. And you have a lot of these CSI type people on the internet who come in and they say, oh, well, this says they fled. And then the first one is they said. And so they what they do is they go in and they point out these perspective
These
differences.
witness account differences.
These witness account differences, and they try to say that proves that it's all false. And so what's really interesting is, now we could go through these line by line if you like, but what's interesting is today at Harvard Law, they have a book that they use that was written by a Harvard Law professor about, 75 years ago, I guess, if I add it up. But he basically said the nature of evidence in a court of law. So he wrote a book of what evidence is allowed, what evidence isn't, what's relative, what isn't relevant,
They use that as basically a definition of what evidence can or can't be.
Can't be, yeah. And this is the definitive work, okay? It also is, he happened to be a Christian. And you know what he did? He said, I will pay anybody $50,000 if they can prove that this account of the resurrection is false in a court of law. To this day, no one's been able to do it. Okay, so that just gives you an overview of what's going on here. And basically the reason why is because if you're really going to evaluate this, then you have to evaluate it on the basis of eyewitness testimony. And what happens is that you have a car wreck, okay, in an intersection. You have somebody standing on the north corner, the south corner, the east corner, and the west corner, okay? They're all going to describe the event from a different perspective, and a defense lawyer is going to come in and try to say, hey, guess what? Your guys are wrong, because you're saying this happened and you're saying that happened. Because one person say, well, I saw this car coming from the east, and somebody else say, well, I saw this car coming from the west. Aha, that's a contradiction. And it didn't happen. But really all you're saying is that from their perspectives, and then they're explaining it from different angles. Okay, but what happened in the intersection? There was a car wreck. And so you have to approach it from that perspective. The other thing too is it's an issue of time frame, and that is that okay?
Maybe they did run away and didn't tell anybody, but then they eventually went and told somebody, or
exactly, yeah, and how that all plays out. So these are easily explainable differences because it's not just their perspective. We have one from Peter, and then we ended up having ultimately about the resurrection over 500 different witnesses that have seen it. So that would be the response to that right there.
Yeah, and I think that's a great example of the Gospels are told as stories. They're like a biographical thing.
Sketch,
but back then a biography was not, what a biography is today. And they focused on the stories and the narratives, which doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just means they were focusing on certain parts of the story.
Yeah.
And those statements don't necessarily disagree with each other. Okay, so they ran away. They didn't say anything to anybody. Well, for how long? Because they said it to people eventually, right? It's not making them claim that they said nothing to anyone forever.
Correct.
So obviously they said it sometime. So were they just not telling people on the way back? Did they wait to tell the disciples? I don't know.
Did they run to the other side of Jerusalem and have lunch and then decide to come back? Or did they just, their ladies, did they run down around the corner, right? And did they stop there and then they were like, oh my goodness, what's going on? And then immediately go back? We don't know.
This incredibly linear, exact, technical account of what happened. It's a story about what happened. And a story about what happened, that doesn't mean it's not true. It just means that this was a different perspective, or they're describing things differently. And that's what happens.
Scholars have known this for thousands of years. Scholars have known this forever.
And what I was going to say is there's a great website called BibleHub.com. It's not like the first one that pops up if you are like looking for just a Bible verse. But what I like about BibleHub.com is you can go to a verse and they have a little thing and kind of like they have a banner at the top of the page. And if you go down a couple levels on that banner, there's a thing that says comment. And if you hit that button, it gives you commentary from a lot of different guys that are, some of them are hundreds of years old, some of them are newer, but all these guys who have done expositions of the Old Testament or the original language and talk about these definitions. And guess what? People have been thinking about these things for a long time.
Yes.
You can find a commentary that was written in the 1640s. So you go back and you're like, okay, so they were thinking about why does Mark and Matthew say different things about what the women did? And this was almost 400 years ago. And they're like, well, here's our take on it. Here's why we think, because smart people have been Christians for a long time.
A long time,
and they have the same questions. But instead of taking those questions and saying immediately, oh, this is a contradiction, they say, this is interesting. Let's look into it. Why is it this way?
And it's not very rational. It's not very scientific to approach something from that. The first point of studying any of this stuff is, well, what are they saying and what did they mean? And if I'm an intellectually honest person, I'm going to say, well, I want to figure out what it is. And then once I know, then I can decide whether I agree with it or not, right?
Well, and it's that idea of wrestling with your faith, right? Like it's not God does not call us to just blindly follow, but instead he's like,
Correct.
you need to work through this and you have to be sure this is what you want. And all of the most devout Christians are people that have actually gone through the process of wrestling it. They've critically thought through all of these ideas and gone,
Yes.
okay, can I accept this? What does this mean? Does this bother me enough that I need to go research it to figure it out? And they're not just going, nope, I'm just going to say whoever. The shallow Christians do that. They go, I'm just going to blindly believe whatever the pastor up on there tells in the cool shoes tells me to do, right? But the people who are really devout and who really have a relationship with God and who have really worked through it are the ones that have gone through and done the research and gone, hey, this is an argument. I'm going to figure it out. And so that I know what I believe and why I believe it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and I think what's great about your point is that a strong faith encompasses the totality of human experience.
Yeah.
So your faith has to have an emotional response to it, right? It has to be emotionally engaged at times. You know, I think of a lot of times throughout my journey with the Lord where he's moved me to really powerful, overwhelming emotions, you know? But also my brain has to be fully engaged in the process. And not just that, sometimes it's just basic will, and that is discipline. Sometimes just disciplining myself to do things is important. And so, you know, it's mind, will, emotions. It's all of these things that really are on the surface of my soul and feed my soul. So it's a totality of the experience. You can't just ignore one. You got to engage the whole person. And that's what we try to do on the Salty Pastors. We want your whole person engaged.
There's one more I want to go over. It looks like we have a few minutes left. I want to talk about a theology one that is in the New Testament, because we did like a theology one from the Old Testament with Ezekiel and Exodus. This one is Romans and 1 John. It is a little bit of a softball, beware. In Romans 3:23, what does that one say? Anyone know that one?
For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God.
So that means we've all sinned, right? But in John, it says, no one who is born of God sins. But he who is born of God keeps him, and the evil one does not touch him. But we've all sinned, and we don't sin. How does that make sense, Pastor?
Is that 1 John or 2?
1 John. 1 John chapter 5. We also see that kind of argument made by John in 1 John chapter 3, verses like 6 and 9. I can take this one for you if you'd like.
Well, you go first as I'm pulling it up real quick.
Another example of taking the verse out of context, because I forget which exact section this is, but if you go to 1 John chapter 3 or 1 John chapter 5 and read them, you will see that John says, you know, no one who has been born of God sins. No one does. But if you do. So in his own statement that no one who has been born of God sins, he says, but if you do. So it's obviously like he's not thinking that nobody born of God says, because he has the very next statement is, but if, and it's more of a when, right?
Right.
You know, but if this happens, when this happens, go to Jesus because he advocates for you, is what he says. And so I think what we're seeing here, and some of this, when you see these contradictions, is really a lack of understanding of what it means to know Jesus. Because what it means to know Jesus is, yes, we're born of God, but as Paul talks about, and it's not Gnosticism, he's not saying all physical things are evil, but he talks about the difference between the spirit and the flesh. And the spirit is willing and wants to know God and follow him, and that's who we're meant to be, but the flesh holds us back, and we still sin. We have these natures in us that compete. Well, that's exactly what John is saying here is no one who is born of God sins. Well, okay, the spirit of God inside of us, the life that we have, because God is life, so we're alive because of him. That part, that it doesn't sin. We don't sin, but we're more than just that.
Right.
And so when we, you know, and we can act as we're born of God, and we can be, and the Holy Spirit comes into us, and we can behave like we're born of God, but that's not a permanent state for us yet. And we, you know, again, that's kind of elementary Christianity, right? We kind of understand that. So there's times when, I don't want to get into Calvinism here, but I don't believe in what is the pillar about how everything we do is wrong or whatever.
Total depravity?
Yeah, total depravity. I disagree with that. Now we can have, if you're a Calvinist out there, we can have a debate about this. That'd be great. You know,
Just remember your grandpa was a 5-point
I know,
Calvinist.
yes, but my dad isn't.
That did not trickle down, apparently.
I was going to say, but my dad's not. So,
But see, what's interesting is that there's just more fallacies. There's no desire to understand what is really being said. There's no grace or even scholarship to attempt to understand. These people wrote 2,000 years ago. What is John actually saying? If you read the passage, he talks about no one who's following Jesus or love Jesus sins continually. It's kind of like, what he's basically saying is this: no man who loves his wife looks at other women. But if he does, he says he's sorry. That you see what I'm saying? It's like you're a man, you love your wife, and you see another woman, and I mean 99.9% of the time you're not looking at other women, But on occasion, this woman walks by and you go, "Wow, that's a beautiful woman." Maybe she reflects your wife. I don't know, but you go, "Well, I'm not going to go down that path." Right? And so I think that's really significant. That's what he's talking about. He's talking about normal life, like you said. We make commitments. We live for these commitments. They are our primary goal, but we're not perfect, right? And so we're just restored. And so, but if we can't live incongruently, is what John is saying. You can't say, I love God and I want to be in a relationship with him, but I want to do all this stuff continually over here. That's the same thing as a guy saying, hey, I want to be married to you and I love you, but I still want to date and sleep with other women all the time. That doesn't make any sense.
That's a contradiction. Yeah.
So I have absolutely loved this to the point where I feel like we almost should do this again at some point, because I think this is really fun. But I think ultimately what this proves is the point of the Salty Pastor podcast, and what any good Christian who really wants to deepen their faith should do. And that is, you need to go into these things and really wrestle with them and fight them and look at them clearly. This is not a thing where you are encouraged, at least here at Foothills, to not look at the man behind the curtain and just blindly believe anything that is espoused. From either side, you need to be working through your faith yourself. You need to be going and doing the research. You need to be going and looking at these arguments and going, hey, that sounds like a good argument.
Is there anything wrong with it?
Something?
Well, and that's why I mentioned Bible Hub. I think for different people, it's going to be a different amount. I know that with my dad and a little bit with me, we enjoy researching this stuff and reading a lot. So we, look at all these contradictions and we dive into them a little bit more than other people. But I think that every single one of us should. And that's why I mentioned Bible Hub, because I think that's a great place to go. Because again, Christianity's been around for 2,000 years, and there have been smart people who were Christians and looked at these same contradictions. I'm using air quotes if you're just listening, and been like, what does this mean? What is this argument? The first apology was written by Justin Martyr around 140 AD?
Yeah.
So we have almost 1,900 years of...
He put the martyr in martyrdom.
He did. We have almost 1,900 years of apologetics. And so, and again, you don't have to go get a PhD in this. It doesn't have to be, the biggest focus of your faith, but it is healthy to have a piece of this. And if you hear a contradiction that worries you, or you hear a claim about how Jesus, and Christianity is false, and that concerns you, and it makes you concerned about your faith, you go and you study it, and you can use Bible Hub and the internet resources. You can come talk to people at the church, and talk with people in your small group that There's so many different ways to look at this and observe, and then, as Jesse says, do it yourself.
And that's what's so important is when you come across a glitch or a problem, it's an opportunity to get stronger. And it's not the absence of doubt that makes a faith strong. It's the presence of doubts that you work through that make you strong.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both so much for joining me today here on the Salty Pastor podcast. And our audience, I'm sure, will have a lot to ruminate on after those debates. And we'll have to maybe bring this back a couple times a year and just really hash out some ideas and stuff, because I think that helps us all grow. So thank you guys so much for joining us. Please make sure you tune in on Sunday to listen to Zac talk more about contradictions as he preaches. And thank you so much for joining us. And we'll see you then here at Foothills Christian Church.
Blessings.